This is the story of Michael Dudikoff, the 1980s action star who was verbally promised the role of Spider-Man by a major studio head, only to watch the opportunity vanish into development hell while his career faded into obscurity. But here's the twist. The narrative that Hollywood deliberately erased him is actually a myth, and the real story reveals something far more interesting about how the entertainment industry actually works. What we're covering today goes beyond the surface-level conspiracy theory. We're examining the verified connection between Dudikoff and Spider-Man, exploring the absolute disaster that was Canon Films' attempt to make a Spider-Man movie, and then separating the facts from the fiction about what actually happened to his career. When you look at the evidence, the conspiracy theory falls apart, but what replaces it is actually a better story about the harsh realities of B-movie stardom in the 1990s and how an entire generation of action heroes simply aged out of an industry that stopped needing them. If you're in your 20s or 30s right now, Michael Dudikoff's name probably means nothing to you. But if you were renting VHS tapes in the mid-1980s, or if you grew up watching martial arts movies with your dad, Dudikoff was everywhere, for a brief window of time that felt eternal when you were a kid with nothing but weekend trips to the video store. 1985 brought him a film called American Ninja, shot for $1 million that pulled in $10.5 million at the domestic box office alone. That kind of return on investment turned Dudikoff into Canon Films' golden boy overnight, spawned a franchise, and made him one of the most recognizable faces in low-budget action cinema for a few years. The film had everything the era demanded: martial arts, explosions, a charismatic lead who could pull off fight choreography, and just enough plot to string together the action sequences without getting in the way. 2 years later, he signed a 7-picture deal with Canon Films, making him a contract player the studio could theoretically assign to any project they wanted. This was standard practice at Canon, a studio that operated more like a factory than a traditional production company, churning out films at a pace that would be unthinkable today. And according to Dudikoff himself, the studio head Menahem Golan made him some very big promises about where his career was heading. Promises that ranged from Superman to Spider-Man to teaming up with Charles Bronson. The American Ninja franchise became Dudikoff's calling card, but it was also the ceiling of his career. While the first film succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, the sequel, American Ninja 2 in 1987, pulled in $4 million, still profitable, still successful by Canon standards, but already showing the signs of diminishing returns that would plague every franchise the studio touched. Multiple interviews confirm what happened next, and this is where the story gets interesting, because Dudikoff has been remarkably consistent about the details. In February 2016, Dudikoff sat down with Den of Geek, and in 2015 he talked to Coming Soon, and in both conversations he verified that Menahem Golan verbally promised him the role of Spider-Man, not once, but multiple times, along with several other major superhero roles that Canon was trying to acquire. When Den of Geek asked if Canon had him in mind for Spider-Man, his answer was revealing in its honesty about how chaotic the studio environment really was. You know, the days with Canon, it was very hectic and it was very fast, and it was very indecisive, he explained. So, 1 minute I was supposed to be doing Spider-Man, then I was going to be doing Superman. It was all speculation, but words that came out of Menahem's mouth. I was under contract. I would wait until I was told what to do and I would do it. The Coming Soon interview went even further and painted a picture of a studio that threw ideas at the wall constantly, without any real plan for execution. Man, there were so many things I was told I was going to be, Dudikoff said. I was going to be Superman. I was going to be Spider-Man. At one point they said they were going to put me together with Charlie Bronson in a picture, and that's what I really wanted to do. That never did happen, but they were working on it. The connection is real. Golan did promise him Spider-Man, and he did it with the same casual confidence he brought to every wild idea that crossed his desk. But here's what gets lost in the Hollywood erased him narrative. This was a verbal promise from one of the most notoriously unreliable studio heads in Hollywood history, For a movie that was already spiraling into one of the most catastrophic development hells ever documented, at a studio that was bleeding money faster than it could make it, Dudikoff was under contract, which meant he had no real power to demand anything or make the promise become reality. Contract players in the old studio system, and Canon operated like a bizarre throwback to that system, simply did what they were told when they were told to do it. Being promised Spider-Man was nice, but it meant nothing without the studio actually having the resources, vision, and competence to make the film happen. Understanding why Golan's promise meant absolutely nothing requires understanding just how spectacularly Canon Films fumbled the Spider-Man project. This wasn't just a movie that didn't get made. This was a 5-year odyssey of incompetence, misunderstanding, and financial collapse that makes for a better story than any action film they ever produced. Canon acquired the Spider-Man rights in 1985 for $225,000, with a 5-year deadline to produce the film. Sounds straightforward, except Menahem Golan and his partner Yoram Globus famously didn't understand that Spider-Man was a superhero, thinking instead he was a horror monster like the Wolfman. These were the same guys running the studio, making million-dollar decisions about major intellectual properties without even understanding what they'd bought. That actually happened, and what came next was even worse. Between 1985 and 1986, they hired director Tobe Hooper, who directed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and knew how to make horror films, but probably wasn't the right choice for a superhero movie to develop a horror version where Peter Parker literally transforms into a giant spider monster. The script treated Spider-Man like a creature feature, completely missing the point of the character and what made the comics work. Stan Lee had to personally intervene to kill this version because it was so far off base it would have destroyed the character and any future potential for the property. Director Joseph Zito took over from 1986 to 1988, developing a more traditional version with Dr. Octopus as the villain, and during this period, they actually discussed casting Tom Cruise as Peter Parker. This was back when Cruise was still doing films like Top Gun and hadn't yet become the massive action star he'd evolve into, so the idea wasn't as crazy as it might sound today. But 1987 brought disaster when two massive Canon productions, Superman 4 and Masters of the Universe, both flopped hard at the box office, burning through budgets and forcing the studio to slash Spider-Man's planned budget from $20 million down to $10 million, which made Zito quit immediately because he knew you couldn't make a proper Spider-Man film for that kind of money, even in the night. By 1989, director Albert Pullen was supposed to be making Spider-Man, but instead he just used the Spider-Man sets they'd already built to shoot a Jean-Claude Van Damme movie called Cyborg. They literally repurposed their Spider-Man production into a completely different film and called it a day, pretending this was always the plan and that they hadn't just wasted years and millions of dollars chasing a property they never understood. April 1990 arrived. The rights lapsed because Canon had failed to produce the film within the contracted time frame, and Canon never shot a single frame of the actual Spider-Man movie, despite spending over $10 million in development costs, including $2 million on scripts alone. That's $10 million thrown into the void for a film that never existed, money the studio couldn't afford to lose given their precarious financial position. Only one person ever had any official attachment to the role, a stuntman named Scott Leva, who appeared in costume on the cover of Amazing Spider-Man issue 262 in March 1985, and did promotional photos that Canon used to generate excitement for a film they had no idea how to make. Dudikoff was never photographed in the Spider-Man costume, never publicly announced for the role, never given a press release or a signed contract or anything concrete that would have made the promise real. Golan's promise to Dudikoff was just words, and at Canon Films, words were cheaper than the film stock they wasted on projects that went nowhere. Dudikoff himself described the environment at Canon in brutally honest terms when he said, "I never knew what I was going to do until I got the script, and then bang, I was doing it." That single sentence captures everything you need to know about how the studio operated, and why being promised anything by Menahem Golan was essentially meaningless. That was how Cannon operated on a daily basis, with Menahem Golan legendary for making grandiose promises that never materialized, announcing dozens of projects at film markets and conventions that never happened, making deals on napkins in restaurants and hotel bars, and operating in a state of perpetual creative and financial chaos that somehow kept producing films even as the company circled the drain financially. Getting verbally promised Spider-Man by Golan was essentially meaningless because he made similar promises to multiple actors across multiple projects, treating his contract players like interchangeable pieces he could slot into whatever project seemed exciting that particular week. The 7-picture contract Dudikoff had with Cannon just meant Golan could theoretically assign him to anything, but it didn't mean any specific project would actually happen, or that the studio had the resources to pull off what they were promising. When people say Michael Dudikoff was promised Spider-Man, that's technically true, but context matters in ways that destroy the conspiracy theory completely. Being promised a promotion at a company that's actively filing for bankruptcy means the promise exists in a vacuum of chaos where it can't possibly matter, and Cannon Films in the late 1980s was essentially a company in slow-motion bankruptcy that kept making films through sheer force of will and increasingly desperate financial arrangements. The studio was also promising Superman to Dudikoff, promising him a team-up with Charles Bronson, promising all sorts of projects that never materialized because the money wasn't there, the vision wasn't there, and the competence to execute at that level simply didn't exist at Cannon Films, no matter how much enthusiasm Golan brought to his promises. And that brings us to the heart of this story: the claim that losing the Spider-Man role somehow led to Dudikoff being erased from Hollywood. This narrative has been repeated across YouTube videos and internet forums for years, gaining traction because it fits a compelling template. Talented actor gets screwed over by Hollywood, loses his big break, and gets blacklisted for reasons that seem mysterious and sinister. But when you actually look at the facts, it completely falls apart under even basic scrutiny. The most obvious problem is timing, which destroys the conspiracy theory before it even gets started. Cannon's Spider-Man project died when the rights lapsed in April 1990, yet Dudikoff continued working steadily throughout the 1990s, making 15-plus films between 1995. He starred in a CBS TV series called Cobra that ran for 22 episodes from 1993 to 1994, getting a network television showcase that most action stars of his era never received. Does that sound like someone who was blacklisted or deliberately erased from the industry? Does that sound like someone who lost opportunities because he'd been promised a role that fell through? Network television doesn't hire actors who've been blacklisted, and CBS wouldn't have given him a series if there was any industry-wide conspiracy to keep him from working. December 1992 brought Dudikoff suing Cannon Pictures for unpaid wages from 4 films, which is public record, and represents a standard contract dispute between an actor and a studio that was already in financial trouble. If Hollywood had conspired to erase him because of the Spider-Man situation, why would he be suing his former employer for money they owed him instead of being quietly pushed out of the business? The lawsuit shows he was willing to fight for what he was owed, that he had legal representation backing him up, and that the courts took his side seriously enough to let the case proceed. The erasure narrative also ignores the fact that Dudikoff kept getting work throughout the decade, appearing in films like Soldier Boys, Chain of Command, and Ringmaster, continuing to find roles even as the direct-to-video market shifted and contracted around him. These weren't major studio releases, but they were work, they paid, and they kept him visible to fans who were still renting action movies at video stores across the country. The truth is far less dramatic but far more interesting, because Michael Dudikoff's career followed the exact same trajectory as virtually every B-movie action star of his era, not because they were erased, but because the entire industry that sustained them collapsed under the weight of changing economics, evolving technology, and shifting audience expectations. Compare Dudikoff to his peers, and the pattern becomes obvious to anyone paying attention. Dolph Lundgren peaked between 1985 and 1992 with films like Rocky IV and Universal Soldier, then spent decades making direct-to-video films that went straight to rental shelves. Jean-Claude Van Damme peaked from 1988 to 1994, with theatrical releases like Bloodsport, Kickboxer, and Time Cop, then transitioned to direct-to-video from the late 1990s onward, as his box office appeal faded. Steven Seagal peaked from 1988 to 1994, with Above the Law, Hard to Kill, and Under Siege, and has made over 50 direct-to-video films since the 2000s that most people don't even know exist. Cynthia Rothrock, who starred alongside Dudikoff in several films and was arguably the biggest female action star of the era, peaked from 1986 to 1996, and then also shifted to a long direct-to-video career that continued into the Every single one of them followed this pattern, making Dudikoff the norm rather than the outlier. The idea that he was uniquely erased while his peers all continued working in exactly the same diminished capacity shows the conspiracy theory doesn't hold up to even basic comparison. 5 specific factors explain what actually happened to his career, and none of them involve a conspiracy or Hollywood blacklist. First, Cannon Films collapsed when the company filed for bankruptcy in December 1994, after years of financial turmoil, which meant Dudikoff's primary employer simply ceased to exist and took his most reliable source of work with it. Cannon had been the studio that understood how to market him, that knew how to build franchises around his particular talents, and when it disappeared, so did that infrastructure. Second, the direct-to-video market contracted as the VHS rental boom that sustained B-movie action careers peaked in the early 1990s before the market shifted toward family films and blockbuster rentals. R-rated martial arts films got squeezed out by economics, not personal vendettas, as video stores realized they made more money from new releases of major studio films and family-friendly content that parents would rent for their kids. The shelf space that used to go to American Ninja sequels started going to Disney releases and romantic comedies instead. Third, the CGI revolution changed audience expectations when Terminator 2 came out in 1991, with liquid metal effects that blew minds, followed by Jurassic Park in 1993, with dinosaurs that looked real, and The Matrix in 1999, with bullet time that redefined what action sequences could look like. These films fundamentally transformed what audiences expected from action movies, making low-budget martial arts films with practical stunts look dated by comparison as technology moved on, and the B-movie action genre couldn't keep up without the budgets to compete. Fourth, Dudikoff made personal choices that limited his career momentum when he turned down American Ninja 3 in 1989. For 2 reasons. He didn't want to be typecast in martial arts roles forever, and he opposed filming in apartheid-era South Africa, where the production was scheduled to shoot. That's a principled stance worth respecting, showing he had values beyond just making money, but it broke his momentum with the franchise that had made him famous and gave him whatever leverage he had in the industry. American Ninja 3, made without him and starring David Bradley instead, earned under $1 million theatrically, showing the franchise was already dying, and his absence just accelerated the inevitable decline. And fifth, the part that matters most, and that conspiracy theorists always ignore. Dudikoff chose family over Hollywood when he married his wife Belle in 2004, and explicitly prioritized being a father over chasing roles. His own words from a 2016 interview lay it out clearly with no ambiguity. When you're a daddy, it's really not all about you. He transitioned into real estate and stepped back from acting by choice, which wasn't erasure but a conscious decision to live a different kind of life, where he could be present for his 3 children instead of flying around the world making low-budget action films for diminishing return. The financial reality of Dudikoff's career tells its own story through cold, hard numbers that don't lie and can't be spun into conspiracy theories. American Ninja made $10.5 million domestically in 1985 on a $1 million budget, representing a massive success that any studio would kill for and proving Dudikoff had genuine box office appeal when the material and marketing aligned properly. American Ninja 2 in 1987 made $4 million, which was still profitable and still successful by Cannon standards, but showed a significant drop of more than half the original's take, even though the sequel came just 2 years later. That's a bad sign for any franchise, suggesting audience interest was already fading, or that the market was getting saturated with similar films competing for the same viewers. American Ninja 3 in 1989, made without Dudikoff and starring David Bradley in the lead role, earned under $1 million theatrically and basically killed the franchise's theatrical viability. Audiences didn't show up without the original star, proving Dudikoff had been the draw, but they also weren't showing up in the numbers Cannon needed to justify continued theatrical releases even when he was in the films. American Ninja 4 in 1990 earned under $500,000 despite bringing Dudikoff back in a supporting role alongside Bradley, showing that even his return couldn't save a franchise that had lost its audience completely. The well was dry, the concept was played out, and no amount of nostalgia could bring back viewers who'd moved on to other things. The franchise experienced rapidly diminishing theatrical returns, regardless of whether Dudikoff was involved, and while the VHS and international markets kept these films profitable for a while through rental income and foreign sales, the theatrical performance couldn't sustain a major studio career or give Dudikoff the leverage to demand better roles. When your movies stop making money in theaters, studios stop giving you theatrical releases, and that's just basic math with no conspiracy required and no blacklist necessary to explain the decline. Meanwhile, the Spider-Man property went through 25 years of development hell before the Sam Raimi film finally came out, and this timeline matters because it shows just how disconnected Dudikoff's missed opportunity was from the actual Spider-Man movie that eventually got made and became a cultural phenomenon. After Cannon's rights lapsed in 1990, the rights transferred to Carolco Pictures for $5 million, already a significant increase from what Cannon had paid and showing how much the property's perceived value had grown even without a successful film. Between 1990, James Cameron became attached and wrote a 57-page scriptment for an R-rated dark vision of Spider-Man that would have been completely different from anything audiences eventually got, with Leonardo DiCaprio discussed for the role of Peter Parker during this period when he was still primarily known for teen dramas and hadn't yet become the Titanic megastar. From 1993 to 1999, massive legal battles involving 4 bankruptcy cases and 5 lawsuits involving 18 separate written agreements tied up the Spider-Man rights in corporate warfare that made the property essentially untouchable. Between 1994 and 1996, Carolco, 21st Century Films, and Marvel Comics all filed for bankruptcy at various points, leaving the character trapped in legal limbo while lawyers argued over who owned what and which contracts were valid. Sony finally acquired the rights in 1999 for $7 million, with MGM getting James Bond distribution rights in the exchange as part of a complex deal that resolved years of competing claims. Sam Raimi was hired in 2000, bringing a genuine love for the source material and a vision for how to make Spider-Man work on screen. Tobey Maguire was cast after a search that considered several other actors, and in 2002, Spider-Man was finally released, grossing $821 million worldwide, and launching a franchise that would eventually spawn multiple sequels, reboots, and an entire Marvel Cinematic Universe integration. The connection between the low-budget Cannon Films version that Dudikoff was verbally promised in the mid-1980s and the $200 million Sony blockbuster is essentially non-existent. Golan's promise was for a completely different animal, a low-budget action film that would have treated Spider-Man like just another martial arts hero, and even if Cannon had made their Spider-Man movie with Dudikoff it would have looked nothing like the Raimi film, and probably would have been closer to Masters of the Universe in tone and execution, campy, cheap-looking, and quickly forgotten. The conspiracy theory deserves to be addressed head-on, because there is zero evidence of any blacklisting, industry conspiracy, or deliberate erasure, with the evidence actually pointing in the opposite direction and showing Dudikoff maintained positive relationships throughout his career. Dudikoff continued working steadily through the late 1990s, got a network television series on CBS that represented a significant step up from direct-to-video films, and speaks positively about his canon years in every interview without bitterness or claims of mistreatment. When his co-star Steve James died in 1993 at the tragically young age of 41, Dudikoff served as a pallbearer at the funeral, showing strong industry relationships and genuine friendships that survived beyond their working relationship and proved he wasn't isolated or shunned. His films are still being released on Blu-ray, with Kino Lorber putting out a special edition of Avenging Force in 2024 that includes Dudikoff's own commentary track, where he discusses making the film, working with director Sam Furstenberg, and reflecting on his canon years with obvious affection. He participated in documentaries about canon films in 2014, both The Go-Go Boys, The Inside Story of Canon Films, and Electric Boogaloo, The Wild, Untold Story of Canon Films, actively engaging with his legacy rather than hiding from it or refusing to discuss a period he supposedly regrets. He's even written a script for a new American Ninja film, and says it's being looked at by potential producers and studios, which doesn't sound like someone who was erased, but someone who maintains industry connections and is still trying to work when opportunities align with his priorities and his family commitments allow. The 2015 Coming Soon interview captured his attitude perfectly when he said, "I enjoy every moment of the business. I work hard. I am always willing and wanting to do good work. I'd like to work a little more, but I'm here. Doors are opening. I'm a fortunate guy." That's not the statement of someone who was blacklisted or erased. That's someone who understands the reality of his career, accepts it without resentment, and feels grateful for what he had instead of bitter about what he didn't get. As of 2025, Michael Dudikoff is 67 years old, married with 3 children, and living in Rolling Hills Estates in the Palos Verdes area of California. While primarily focused on real estate for the past 2 decades, he's built a life outside the industry that gave him fame, choosing stability and family over the uncertainty of chasing roles that might never come. His estimated net worth sits at approximately $1.5 million, which is modest by Hollywood standards, but comfortable enough to prove he's not living in poverty or serving as a cautionary tale. He's just a guy who had a specific career in a specific era, and when that era ended, he moved on to something else that would provide for his family and give him the stability that acting never could. Recent years brought a few appearances that showed he hadn't completely abandoned acting. Navy SEALs vs. Zombies in 2015 featured him in a supporting role when he returned to acting after years away, reuniting with some of the direct-to-video world he'd left behind. Fury of the Fist and the Golden Fleece came in 2018, another low-budget production that probably paid scale but let him work with friends and stay connected to business. He maintains an Instagram presence where he occasionally posts throwback photos and interacts with fans who still remember his films, stays connected, and remains part of the community that made him famous decades ago. Bringing this all together requires separating what's actually true from what's myth, because the distinction matters more than the conspiracy theory and tells us something real about how Hollywood works versus how people want to believe it works. What's true? Menahem Golan verbally promised Dudikoff the Spider-Man role during the Canon Films era, along with Superman and several other projects that never materialized. Canon's Spider-Man project was a real production that spent years in development hell and millions of dollars before collapsing without shooting a single frame. Dudikoff's career declined significantly after the early 1990s, as the direct-to-video market contracted and the economics of B-movie action films shifted. What's false or unverified? That Dudikoff was ever officially cast or attached to Spider-Man with any formal contract or public announcement. That this missed opportunity somehow led to his erasure from Hollywood through blacklisting or industry conspiracy. That he was blacklisted or deliberately pushed out of the industry by studios working together to deny him opportunities. That his career trajectory was unusual or suspicious compared to his peers who all experienced the exact same decline. The real story is this: Michael Dudikoff was a B-movie action star whose primary studio collapsed under the weight of its own financial mismanagement, whose genre declined due to market forces and technological change that made practical stunt action films look dated, and who eventually chose family over Hollywood when the opportunity cost of continuing to chase diminishing returns became too high. The Spider-Man promise was one of many empty words from a notoriously unreliable studio head operating a company in financial freefall that couldn't deliver on its promises even when it desperately wanted to. Dudikoff's career arc was identical to his peers, shaped by industry-wide economic forces that reshaped Hollywood in the 1990s, rather than any conspiracy. The direct-to-video action market that made stars like Dudikoff, Lundgren, Van Damme, and Seagal collapsed when the economics changed, and video stores realized family films made them more money than R-rated action movies, and some of them kept